Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Talking SaaSy. We are a live show brought to you by Interact, a data science-backed growth agency for founder-led SaaS. I'm your host, Kareen Say, and I couldn't be more excited to jump in here with you for episode 2. Now, if this is your first time on the show, we're all about going behind the scenes to top SaaS growth operators, rising stars, people who are in the trenches, rolling up the sleeves, learning the hard lessons, and coming out the other side with data, with stories, with insights you can't find anywhere else. Today, we are diving into one of the most crucial, now let's be honest, rather tricky aspect of SaaS growth, user onboarding and activation. Now, this is something that I've been pretty obsessed with lately myself, especially after seeing firsthand how a poor onboarding experience can completely derail a promising product. There's nothing sassier, right, than watching your users drop off, especially when you think they're about to get hooked, right? Well, don't worry. I have just the person here today who's going to help us break it all down. Micah McGuire. Micah is a powerhouse when it comes to the psychology of user growth. Micah has specialized in almost everything from copywriting to content, marketing, user research, and what we're here to talk about today, user onboarding and activation sequences. Micah's working with bootstrap product-led companies. She was head of growth at GrowthMentor, and she's brilliant at figuring out what makes users tick. Currently, Micah's working on 2 very exciting ventures. She's consulting for early stage startups, and she's soon to launch a creative writing app later this year. So we are tremendously lucky to have her here today to break it down, some real world strategies that you founders, head of products, lean growth teams, team of one can start using right away. So let's jump right in and let's talk all things onboarding, activation, and user research. I'm going to bring Micah onto the studio with me. Micah, hello.
Hey, Corinne. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. How are you doing today?
Doing great, and thank you so much for that glowing introduction. Greatly appreciate it.
So excited to have you here. So, Micah, I know we've spoken, but before we dig into all the nitty gritty, I'd love for you to, tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us how you ended up on this journey called SaaS.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I am actually one of the folks that took a very winding, odd journey into marketing and into SaaS. So I actually started off, I guess I take it back to my university days. I studied microbiology. Then, right out of college, I got a job as a health coach at a medical weight management clinic that used cognitive behavioral therapy techniques or CBT techniques. And basically, that I feel like kind of laid my foundation for understanding a lot about both experimentation and about user psychology, because my job as a health coach was essentially to talk to patients and walk them through how to basically improve their diet, improve their exercise routines, all of that, and help them get any blockers that they were facing out of the way. So over time, basically, I got interested in marketing because basically on this health clinic, it was a team of 3 of us, and I was the only one that basically was able to handle the marketing side of things. So I kind of started taking that on, got really interested in the tech space, and ended up in SaaS originally through GrowthMentor. I joked that the company was so great. I worked for them twice. So I originally worked as kind of their PR contractor, and then just ended up moving into a lot of other B2B and B2C SaaS roles.
Very, very cool. I love how diverse your background is, from fitness to SaaS. We'll draw that bridge here on this show. Yeah. So I'm gonna start it off easy. I know you've worked with a range of bootstrap companies, SaaS companies. So question number 1 for you: what do you think is the most often overlooked aspect of user onboarding, especially in this early stage?
Yeah, so I think that if we look at the steps that lead up to onboarding, I think most marketers, and I would even say most founders, have a good understanding that everything that we're putting out there needs to be reflecting the user back to them and needs to be basically convincing them, hey, we're the product for you. We can get the job done. We can do what you need to have done. We promise. And I feel like as soon as we get to onboarding, that just gets thrown out the window. We just sit there and go, okay, we've got you in the product now. We're just going to bombard you with question after question, not really paying attention to how this is affecting you, not really paying attention to how we're using this to personalize things, and also not paying attention to the, I guess, the emotional context that comes into this. And I know probably some of my B2B folks are kind of rolling their eyes, but I will say, it doesn't matter. B2B and B2C, you have folks that are walking in as irrational creatures, basically, that we have to take that into account to some degree. So we kind of lose that context, I feel like, when we get to onboarding.
Yeah, I love that. Like I like to say, B2B ultimately is H to H, human to human.
Yep.
So, I think B2C
Absolutely.
has a more representative term of, that game plan, if you like, right?
Right.
Ultimately, it doesn't matter. You're still communicating with people here.
Yeah.
So I do want to dig in a little bit here on, what that all means in the context of activation. Let's say, how do you personalize it? How do you not make someone feel bombarded?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things that we need to keep in mind is that the main principle of any onboarding and activation sequence needs to be, this is not about you. This is not about the app. This
Yeah.
is about what do you need in order to A, make the user's experience easier, or B, understand more about them in order to do that. So basically, if there's a bit of your product that isn't necessarily intuitive, that you know that most users need to use, then pointing that out in a tour, something like that, that makes perfect sense because you don't want your users to be frustrated. That's part of making their life easier. If you're asking questions, those questions need to come from the context of how can I narrow down this user's psychographics? And you'll notice I said psychographics, not demographics, and I'll get on my rant about that in a little while, I'm sure. But understanding their psychographics, understanding where they're coming from, understanding what their mindset is, because that should be what we're doing. Is we're sitting here going, okay, how can I make your life easy? What do I need to know in order to make your life easy? And that should be it. It's not necessarily about the app itself. Yes, we want to drive people to that aha moment to where they get the value out of the app. But for a lot of early stage companies, most early stage companies don't know what that moment is. They don't understand that. So therefore, we have to accept the fact that we're essentially flying blind in those cases. Now, if you are one of those rare early stage companies that hit that aha moment and everything else, then maybe your activation approach is going to differ a little bit, but you still don't want to be throwing questions out there that the user gets to them and they go, why are you asking me this? And I think the classic one that I always point to that's outside of product really, but webinar registration forms. Why do you need my phone number? Why do you need what
Right.
company I work for? Why do you need how much money my company makes? It's this aspect of, I would say, invasiveness, that it has to be balanced. And basically I can kind of get into that. I know we had discussed maybe talking about a little bit about fitness apps, but I can
Yeah.
kind of talk about that balance of, the invasiveness of the question versus whether it's worth it to the user to answer. And I think in the case of most webinar registration forms, it's not. Most users are going to say, I will give you my name, I may give you my job title, and I'm going to give you my email because I've got to have it to get the invite. But I think those are about the only questions that most users would be willing to answer for a webinar registration.
Yeah. I love when you brought up the fitness app because it's so relatable. I do remember the moments when, I have downloaded the app and I did not feel invaded at all when they were asking me all these questions, because I know these are questions that ultimately are geared to serve me, right?
Exactly.
So very positive experience. I certainly want to, if you wouldn't mind, like kind of dig into that a little. What are some examples from a H2H B2B perspective that a similar experience as a fitness app could be replicated within a B2B onboarding activation experience?
Just to quickly cover what I'm talking about with the fitness apps for anyone who may not have used them, this is a lot of calorie trackers. This is a lot of, say, like exercise apps and things like that. These tend to come right out of the gate with a bunch of questions that are highly personal and a lot of times fairly sensitive in some cases. So
Mhm.
they're going to ask for your height. They're going to ask for your weight. They're going to ask, what are your goals in your fitness journey? It's a lot of questions that in any other context, I feel like people would again get defensive because they're like, oh, this is invasive. I don't like this. But because a user of those apps understands, oh, you're using this to set this up for me, they're
Yep.
willing to answer those things. So from a B2B context, I would say, what's the minimum you need to know about the user in order to serve them? And you'll notice I say minimum because I think there are things that we think are important that may not necessarily be important. And it's like, for example, the one that I always get tripped up on is when people ask me for my location. I'm kind of sitting there going, okay, unless I'm on, say, like Meetup or something like that, or why do you need this from me? It's basically, I live in a small tourist town kind of thing. So it's like, what purpose is this serving? So I think that looking at that minimum and then not really going beyond that if you can resist it. Now, I know there's going to be experiments down the road where you're going to put questions in and ask things that maybe the users don't like that. That's the beauty of running these as growth experiments is the whole point is we put this up for a couple of weeks, we see if users like actually answer the question, then we see if it's actually
Yeah.
useful to them, and we go from there. But, I guess it would depend on like the specific B2B app. I know for a lot, your department, very, very necessary in most cases, especially
Mhm.
if we're dealing with a very horizontal product. Airtable is a perfect example. There's so many use cases they could cover. So therefore, if they know, hey, this person is in marketing versus this person's in sales versus this person's in product, huge difference on what they're going to set the
Yeah.
product up as. And again, I think it all comes back to, are you actually using it to improve the user experience? And if you're not, why are you asking it? Because
Right.
if it's part of learnings so you can use it to improve the experience, okay, all right, that is fair enough. But if you are just not going to touch that stuff and not going to use it to basically
Mhm.
deter that cold state problem that we get into when anybody opens up an app for the first time, then it really has no business being in your onboarding.
Not a priority. Yep.
Mhm.
So on this trajectory of user centricity here, I want to turn over to copywriting
Mhm.
because I know you are an expert in copywriting. So you want us to benefit from your expertise there. So how important is the language that we use in onboarding? How do you keep it user centric throughout that journey? What's the utility of language there?
Yeah. It's incredibly because I think this all comes back to making the users feel like you care. And again, I know most people in B2B are rolling their eyes. It's true. Think about the brands that are B2B that you've really got affinity for. And
Mhm.
chances are, whenever you walked through their process with their product, you probably felt like to some degree, it may not be the warm fuzzies that you get with a B2C app, but probably to some degree, you felt like, okay, all right, they understand. They know what I'm going through. So that's what you're doing to prove to the user there. And that's why you're focusing on their needs. That's why you're focusing again back to that same goal of how you can serve them essentially. And I think sometimes it helps to have like helper text in a lot of cases that explains, why do I actually need this question? Why do I need this information from you? Because it's again going back to the fitness apps, usually there's a little tiny like bit of eyebrow copy or something like that just kind of tucked away that says, by the way, we need this to estimate your total daily calories needed, or we need this to in order to
Mm.
build the correct fitness routine for you. So all of that is kind of, it's answering user objections in a way.
Yep.
So, and I think a lot of companies, especially the early stage, kind of forget to do that because they, just think, oh, well, of course these people will answer these questions. It's like they may or they may not.
Yeah.
And if you give them a reason, they are more likely to do so. It's like I think I remember there was a study that basically there was a done. And there were folks in a very long line for a printer. And the scientists were running this social experiment on, okay, if somebody needed to cut in line to basically get some printing done ahead of everybody else, then was there a way that they could do that? And typically, if people came with like a good reason of like, hey, I really need to jump in front line here because I'm about to be late to class or something like that, people were more likely to actually go, okay, all right, I'll give you some leniency here. And I think they tested all kinds of different like options that they gave in different scripts. So I can't remember off the top of my head which one actually won out. But again, it's that giving that person a reason instead of just saying, hey, I just need to go to the front of the line kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's also communication, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what is one quick win founders can start implementing today to improve their onboarding copy?
Gosh, I would say first and foremost, look at your flow and see what is actually being used to personalize the experience. And anything that's not, just go ahead and rip it out, because it's basically, if you're not using it in some way or you're not planning to use it in order to improve. So like I said, if we're using this, you're building a base because you need to know, let's say, that department angle. There's nothing in your app right now that personalizes based on department, but in 3 months, you guys want to build something that personalizes on department. That's fine. But if you just know, hey, we're just using this for internal data, I'd probably take that out and would move it to later on, because especially if you have in-app prompts or anything like that, then that should be a place where you can ask those kinds of things later on, preferably when your user has a little bit more affinity for you, your app, and your brand on top of it. Then from a copywriting angle, I would look at it and see how much that you're putting the user as the center of this. Again, it comes back to that, we versus you kind of language. You want it to be focused on them, focus on the you, and again, explaining the why in cases that it's not clear. Obviously, if somebody walks in and, it's an office locator app or something like that, and you ask for the location, I think most people can assume, hey, this is going to be used to personalize my experience. But if it's not immediately obvious and you definitely need that information, then just tell them why. It's, again, all back to good communication, all back to treating people like human beings.
And keeping it simple language.
Yes, exactly. So, we don't want to basically, I think a lot of us run to all these power verbs because we want to kind of like try to wow our audience and things like that. And activation and onboarding is a case of like, stop with the razzle dazzle. You don't need it because they're in the app at that point. So basically just use very simple, concrete language. It may not be the prettiest, and your copywriter may go, oh gosh, I wish I could kind of pretty this up. But there are ways of making language nicer that doesn't necessarily involve adding a whole bunch of flash to it.
Yeah. So conversational is okay?
Yes, gosh, yes. Please make it conversational. I think that's the one main problem that all B2B copywriting has, is they're so worried about their reputation and looking impressive that they forget you're just talking to people. It's, if you would talk, and I think this is why so many copywriters talk about in B2B copywriting. If you wouldn't speak like that to somebody at a dinner party, then that's not going to work in your B2B copy kind of thing.
I'm slowly training myself out of that bad habit of, stiff corporate language. And not to go off tangent here, but LinkedIn is a great way to practice that, because you want it to be conversational. You want it to be as if you're talking to someone at a dinner party. So I certainly can appreciate the power of a simple conversational copy.
And also
perfect grammar.
And follow people that do that. If there's a bunch of people that basically you're following, that they use all of these, corporate jargon terms and things like that, get that off your feed, because that's probably in some way affecting your writing brain. And surround yourself with people that do write conversationally. These are usually the ones that are, quote unquote, the greats on LinkedIn and everything else. So
exactly, it's human to human. So, all right. So let's talk about buyer research, persona research. I think you've been pretty vocal about the need for research to back personas, right? These presentations of people that you are serving. So for bootstrap founders, curious to hear, especially when they have very, very lean teams, what are some practical, low-cost ways to gather meaningful user insights.
Yeah.
Okay,
So I know if there's any UX researchers watching this, just cover your ears because you're going to run screaming out of the room. But I think for any kind of an early stage, scrappy startup, you can get away with almost 80% of what you need to know through either interviews or surveys, and surveys with the caveat of it depends on how much of a user base you have, because surveys can be dangerous if you are dealing with a very small sample size. So if you are at a stage where you guys only have, like 5,000 users, all 5,000 users are not going to respond to that survey. Period. End of statement. I don't know any app product out there that basically could get that kind of a response rate. You're probably going to be dealing with things that, if you're lucky, maybe 30% respond. That's going to be a vanishingly small sample size. And if you're not careful about how you interpret those results, you can end up being skewed in certain ways. So basically, this all comes back to an understanding of like sample sizes and that kind of thing. And this, for me, comes back to my science background, because we had to run so many experiments, that sort of thing. We were talking whenever it's dealing with certain cultures, we would have, say, sometimes 40 to 50 species that we were trying to identify activity for a certain enzyme. So that's the kind of basically method and kind of mindset you need to take, is that if you're going to run a survey, it needs to be with a large volume of people, because the smaller the volume is, basically the more dangerous it is that you may get misled, because survey questions are also very, very difficult to create. Now, if you're dealing with, say, you've got several million users and things like that, you can usually get away with basically creating fairly good surveys that will get decently representative results. It may not be perfect, but again, here, I kind of liken it to, we try to treat growth as a physicist or a chemist treats their experiments, because those are the very, very hard sciences, I would say. Whereas everybody probably needs to be thinking more like a biologist, because we are dealing with living things, and basically we have to accept that sometimes it doesn't act the way that we intended. But then going over to interviews, this is probably going to seem counterintuitive, that you can probably get more information out of an interview than you can a survey, because basically, yes, the question setup is still at play. That is still a concern. You want to make that a basically something that you do set up before you walk into an interview. But a very wise head of product once told me, the best interviews are literally just conversations. So I think from that standpoint, you're going to talk to people, and you're going to hear things, and you're going to hear things over and over again. And then, I cannot take credit for this. I was actually taught this by Ryan Paul Gibson, who is a marketing B2B interview master. So, highly suggest folks follow him if you want more on this, especially from the marketing side of things. But he said, you really only need 7 to 12 interviews, because there was actually a scientific study done that they said that, okay, let's see how many interviews it takes for people to get the majority of insights they need.
So
and I think
per persona, sorry.
Yes, exactly. And this is, again, it comes back to, you have to basically segment appropriately. So it would be seven per segment, whatever that is, or 7 to 12 per segment, whatever that is. So with that, basically once you get to past 12 interviews with the similar group of people, then you're going to start hearing the same thing over and over again, and you're really not going to get that many new insights. So it goes, again, back to the 80-20 rule. You'll have 80% of your insights by the time you get there. Now, I know even that number may sound intimidating for a lot of really, really small teams that don't have a lot of resources. I recommend 5 to 7, because that at least will get you maybe 50 to 60%, but it's not going to be exhaustive. But at the same time, if that's the resourcing you've got, something is better than nothing at this point.
Yeah. So, I certainly want to double down on that point. So for founders who are listening, and I think it's so important to really center the voice of your customer, right? And we all think that we know who they are, but there's nothing more, I guess, there's nothing more powerful than actually hearing it from the horse's mouth.
Yeah. Exactly.
Not
And
about fixments of our imagination.
yeah, and I think too, you have to realize that even if you're running interviews for one thing, so let's say you're running activation interviews, you're going to learn things about that audience that are going to help other functions. Because I want you guys to think about this. Copywriting needs voice of customer data in order to write good copy, because the best copy is, again, reflecting the user and their thoughts back at themselves.
Mhm.
Your go-to-market strategy, if you learn that somebody has a huge affinity for your brand, they love your brand, they love your product, that suddenly opens up several GTM motions, including referral, community, potentially partnerships if you're connected
Yep.
to the right people. That's another one. It helps product because people are going to throw offhand in these interviews things they may not like or may love about your app. They may sit there and say, oh, I wish you guys did this, or I used another competitor that also did this and I missed that feature from you guys, or, I absolutely hated this feature when I used it from your
Yes.
competitor. So all of these things are just little offshoots that I think we don't spend enough time analyzing these interviews afterwards to
Yeah.
pick up on. So basically, it's the analysis is an art. And I think it comes down to a couple of things. It comes down to A, somebody has to be very good at pattern recognition whenever they're doing it.
Mhm.
B, actually formatting the data in a way that you can kind of digest it all at the same time. Because I know a lot of people like to do things through, a lot of the design and the visually driven folks like to do things through Figma and do sticky notes. For me, I've never thought in pictures, I've always thought in words. That doesn't click for me. I have to actually sit down and put all of the questions in a Google sheet and say, okay, here's question 1, here's question 2, here's question 3, here's each interview, here's what each of them said to each of these questions, because then that gives me a bird's eye view that I can go, okay, they all said the same thing here, 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 and here. So that analysis is incredibly important. And then also just other functions it helps. CS as well. If there's things that your users find
Yeah.
confusing, then that's something that you can kind of basically smooth out in FAQs if you're not able to smooth it out in product at the moment. I really think there's not a team except for maybe development, and that's just because a lot of times this stuff makes more work for our dev and technical folks. But if they are dedicated to wanting to produce a really good product and dedicated to wanting to help the user, I think even they'll say, hey, this is helpful.
Yep. Great. So certainly with an investment, it's not just one functional job, it's not just
Yeah.
for one function to utilize that research, it's company wide. So it is really a company wide initiative here.
Yeah.
So useful for everybody.
And
Um,
I will say one of the pitfalls that I will just go
mhm.
ahead and note really quickly is whenever you're doing these interviews, make sure you document everything, because the biggest
Mhm.
problem that most companies have is they do this research and then they just kind of let it rot. So if you're doing
Yeah.
this, there's a few suggestions that I had basically when I took the Reforge User Insights course that I really took to heart. First of all, do all of your analysis after every interview, like immediately after each individual. So that's basically you're going to be doing a kind of a rolling wrap up. So you're going to sit down
Mhm.
with one interview and you're going to go, okay, here's all the insights here. And then you're going to do that for the next 5 to 7 interviews. And then you go back and you start looking for larger patterns.
Mhm.
Make sure that those are documented in an easy to understand way so that it can be shared with the other teams, and make sure to share it. Basically, create a culture
Yeah.
to where every time somebody runs an experiment, it gets shared to every single department. And if you've got somebody that is good enough to cover like what every department may need, I know this may be difficult unless you're the founder yourself and understand how these departments interact. If they can put out there, hey, customer service, you may want to look at this part of the report, or
Yeah.
hey, product, you probably want to look at this bit, then that is going to make everything run more smoothly. The last thing you want to do is not share this to everybody,
Yeah.
because again, everyone is going to see different things in the data. They're going to see different things of different importance in the data depending on what their function is. And it's just something that if you don't share it, it will go to waste if you're not careful. You will use it to improve the single project that you're working on and then not touch it again and miss potentially valuable insights out of that. That you'll inevitably probably come back, in probably 3 to 6 months and go, "Oh, we already covered this and we didn't need to do this research project and reinvent the wheel all over again because we actually had a base here."
Yeah. So speaking of sharing, it just reminds me of I was speaking to a sales rep and just trying to personify his
Mhm.
prospects, and I asked him, "Have you looked at some of the jobs to be done that we did,
Mhm.
for your prospects?" He said, "No." I brought it all out, and it was such a game changer. His face just lit up,
Yep.
and you could tell immediately. Suddenly, he was just so unstuck because
Yeah,
your point, there was so much that he could pull from that, incorporate it into his sales outbound cadences, reflecting the
exactly.
language, of the user, because we had a lot of like voice of the customer,
Mhm.
snippets that he could use, and it just made, it was just so encouraging to see how he went from this is terrible, this is horrible, I feel so stuck, to oh my gosh, I know what to do with this, I know how to move forward now. So yeah,
Exactly.
share it.
And
If it's not obvious, share it with anybody within the organization. You all need to know who you're serving as a team.
exactly. And I think too, that point also goes back to whenever people have problems with segmentation, I feel like they're indexing too much on demographics and they need to be indexing on both the psychographics and the jobs to be done because you may have a very, very demographically diverse audience. You may have, if we look at marketers, they come from all over, they come from all sorts of different backgrounds. If we're looking even just under that umbrella of B2B, there's a few hundred industries that could apply to. But if we're saying, okay, all of these marketers need a robust content calendar, that's the job that needs to be done. Then all
Mhm.
of a sudden, you've taken what feels like an overwhelming pool and gotten it down to one target segment. So I think whenever these early stage startups are really struggling, going, we
Yeah.
don't know how to segment our audience, don't index on the demographics, index on the psychographics, their buying journey, and then also all of these jobs to be done. All of that's going to come from your interviews. You
Yeah.
cannot get this really any other way. It has to come out from you talking to your users.
Amazing. So one question, how do we know when research is enough to get started? So we need
This
to think about all the utility of this
Yeah.
research, and then back to the topic here, activation, onboarding.
Mhm.
So how much is enough research to get started?
So, I feel like this is going to start off when you set up your research. You have to know what question it is you're trying to answer. And I
Mhm.
can kind of point this out with one of the research projects that I did, which was basically just a moderated user flow, essentially. Because what we had is we had a case where we had one of our surfaces had an abysmal activation rate. Basically, it was far lower than any of our other surfaces and any of our other for this app. And we were going, okay, well, what on earth is going on here? And I just said, guys, just let me run people through this onboarding process and let me
Mhm.
see if there's a catch somewhere that they're running into. So I think we had probably about 8 interviews that I ran in this. About half of them were current users, and then about half were non-users. That basically I just said, hey, it might be a difference in your comfort level with the product. If you get into the product and you've used us for a while, you may be able to pick up on things more intuitively than a non-user does. So let's make that comparison here.
Mhm.
And I sat down and just told him, I said, okay, I'm going to try to stay as quiet as possible throughout this session. I just want you to walk through this process for me on camera. And basically we were screen sharing at this point. And if you run into a point that you get stuck, tell me. So they sat down. I had gotten a little bit about, some of their demographic data, some of the jobs to be done that they used and things like that. And they walked through it. Every last person got stuck at the exact same
Oh,
point. And I sat there and I went, bingo, there's our problem. It's because everybody is getting to this point and they've downloaded the app, but they can't figure out how to actually get it on and start using it in this environment.
yeah.
And so I sat down with the designer and they came up with a tooltip solution that basically I think we had to something like a 7% improvement in activation rates after that. So, it was basically something that was a fairly easy fix, just again, because everybody was converging on that point. Now,
Mhm.
that was partially dumb luck that basically everybody had ran into this blind spot, and your Studies may not be as clear cut in some cases, but I think the important point is to start off knowing, okay, what's the question we want to answer? Because if I had just walked in saying, oh, we want to understand how people use this surface, then I probably would not have indexed as much on looking through that onboarding sequence. I probably would
Mm,
tell people download the app beforehand and let me know, once you've got it activated kind of thing. So for us, by focusing in on that's the question, we need to figure out why this activation rate is not here. Then we were
mhm.
able to narrow down the experiment. And I think for me, just personally being a perfectionist, I tend to basically be a little bit on the side of wanting to be overcautious, and I have to fight that with myself because I have to realize, there's resources here, we have time, and basically, the amount of spend that we've got to have on this, and I've got to restrain myself sometimes. So I think too, figuring out where you personally index. If you're somebody that, again, wants to over research, then you might need to rein that in a little bit, especially if you're part of a really lean team. If you're
Yeah.
somebody that you feel like you kind of under research, then you may need to basically make sure that your interviews are a little bit more robust, just
Mm,
because you want to make sure that you're getting the full impact of that.
yeah. And again, the bottom line is it's so important to research because in this instance, it sounds like it helped you to course correct, to rectify and reprioritize where you should be focusing your efforts to move people through.
Exactly. And it was for us, luckily, it was a quick fix. I mean, it was
Yeah.
really, I think we got that done in about 2 weeks kind of thing. That basically, I think it may have taken 2 weeks for the design and then maybe a couple of weeks to actually put it
Yeah.
into production. But I mean, that's a month. That's a relatively quick improvement for something that basically got us really good results with this surface.
So important because I hear that a lot of people fall short on that part too. A lot of founders, we get all these people in and then nothing happens. Right?
Exactly.
People just drop off like flies. It's just so heartbreaking. Then you put all this work in to bring them in, and
Yeah.
it didn't go.
And I think this is something that should be stressed to a lot of founders is that the quantitative data is a great thing and it's a wonderful thing and it can help you identify those gaps. If we hadn't had data on what our activation rates looked like for this surface, we would have probably never explored this because we wouldn't have known. It would have been a black box. But we had the data there. We then
Mhm.
used qualitative data to back it up. And I think, this to me was always kind of a natural assumption because, again, having come from the sciences, this is what we do. We make an observation of something and we say, oh, if I put this bacterial species in this area, then basically this happens. And then we go back and we say, okay, well, that's a qualitative observation. So then from the quantitative standpoint, let's go prove it with a whole bunch of experiments.
Yeah, got it. And it seems like what I'm hearing from you as well is let's start by taking a look at your current data. So
Mhm.
let's start with the quant. What do you
Yes.
have now? What is it showing us? What are the gaps? And where are the blockers? Right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
then pull in qualitative to fill in the gaps to address those challenges. Is it
Right.
right? Just start with the
Yes.
existing
And
data.
and I think this also goes into, again, that kind of the research being enough. If you are letting it be driven by whatever quant data you have, then
Mhm,
you are less likely to basically just let the qualitative research run amok. And
mhm.
I know of very few early stage startup teams that are going to run into that problem. Usually, most of the time, the problem you're going to have is convincing people the qualitative data matters. So that's, I think, the one that I see most startups run into is that it's they don't put a value on the qualitative data. They say, "Oh, we want the hard numbers." It's like you have to have both to a certain degree because the quant is going to narrow down your focus. The
Yeah,
qual is going to tell you actually why is this happening? Because again,
exactly.
got to remember, we're dealing with people. No matter what business you're in, you are
Yeah,
dealing with people. There is a level of irrationality and psychology and, all of that that goes into this that is inexplicable and not easy to
yeah.
define and not tangible.
Yeah, yeah, great. So remember, it's quantitative and it's qualitative to give you that holistic contextual look into your users, into your experience, right?
Mhm.
It's not just the
Exactly.
numbers. It's really what is it saying and why, and how are people actually feeling about about coming into your instance in your environment.
Exactly. Because it's really a cycle. Because what's going to happen is you're going to
Yeah,
get quant data, you're going to go do research on it, you're going to use that to make improvements, and then you're going to get more quant data. So
yeah,
it's basically it's a virtuous cycle if basically you're paying attention and making sure that you don't get led
yeah,
astray by, the one user that says, "Oh, we want you to build X." There has to be some form of kind of your own instinct and your own intuition that
yeah,
applies with this. Because again, like I said, not every study is going to be every last one of your users stopped at X point,
yeah,
So you have to kind of use your own intuition for, users said they wanted this, and we had 6 out of the 8 users say they wanted this, but then we also had 2 users that said they wanted Y. And then if you're sitting there and going, I need to prioritize on the one that the 6 users talked about, not the one that the 2 users talked about. Put that in an idea board somewhere and keep it for later.
yeah, yeah. Cool.
So,
I think you've probably addressed this question already, but yeah, very simplistically, what is a clear sign that a persona isn't grounded in real user insights?
to me, it is kind of twofold. First of all, does it feel like you're reading a fictional character profile? If it does, then most likely it's not grounded in actual results. And 2, the dead giveaway for me is it's focused only on demographics. Basically, if you're talking about, what kind of car they drive, what they do for work, how much money they make, and all of that, what their age is, then unless those things are directly relevant to your product, so let's say if you're talking about a skincare product, then
Yeah,
maybe the age matters. Maybe that's worthwhile, but you will have that if you've done your research because you'll know, oh, we get a lot of users that are in their 20s or 30s or 40s kind of thing. And that will narrow it down. So again, and also broad ranges. So like if people walk in and it's like they're in from 20 to 45 and all of that, if it reads like fiction, it probably is fiction.
yeah,
So you've got to back that up. Again, it goes back to the psychographics and it goes back to their jobs to be done. If you have a profile that has a very highly specific job to be done that basically walks through it in detail, then
yeah,
most likely that's a profile that is backed up by data because you don't get that a marketer came in and needed a content calendar that had the ability to repeat events and also link out to webinar software. That's pretty specific. Most people would just say, oh, they need a content calendar in order to plan their multi-channel content.
mm,
That's probably not backed by data. The
mm,
one that mentions that specific webinar integration is probably backed by data because probably somebody had to sit down and go, oh, whenever these marketers are
right.
using this, we have half of our audience using this for webinars and they're doing this workaround with Zoom.
Yeah, yeah.
So
The devil is in the details.
It really is, and I know that everybody gets worried about, "Oh gosh, what if we get bogged down in the details and things like that?" But again, it comes back to that pattern analysis. If you've got somebody that's really good at pattern analysis and really good at identifying, "Hey, this is what the majority is saying versus this is what a small, albeit perhaps very vocal minority is
Yeah,
saying," then that's going to help you balance better over time.
great. So pretend that I'm a founder now, and
Mhm.
this is amazing. There's so much to do though. So what is the simplest first step? And I know how important this is. What's the simplest first step that I can take tomorrow or right now
Yeah.
to start
So
incorporating research into my process?
So I'm going to actually walk through 3. I'll start with the most important one, which I think is identify the specific question or problem you want answered first. Because if you don't do that, then you're going to basically get into designing an interview or something like that that doesn't give you a lot. It's basically
Mhm.
because it's not going to be focused. What that does is that gives you a focus. And if you look at Reforge's user insights program, they use what they call the trailhead approach. So they start off with, oh, you've got to build some rapport and things like that. And then you've got to lay the context for the user to understand why you're asking these questions and what information you need. And then you'll probably get some like demographic, psychographic, all of that information. So you have the where the user is coming from with your product.
Mm,
Then you'll probably ask some warm up questions that basically get you extra information that may be useful. It may not be directly linked to that main question that you're asking, but it's kind of going to be sort of, I guess you would say loosely linked in some way. And then you ask your big question, which is at the top of the mountain, to say, okay, this is what we're really trying to get after. So you will dig into questions at this point and then come down from there. I think that setting this up too rigidly, basically founders need to be careful with that, because it doesn't need to be something that you've got to have set up in a very, very structured way. Because again, we get back to the best interviews or conversations.
Conversations. Yeah.
So again, I think having that structure in mind helps you, because it will keep you focused on that one question. And like I said, that's what you need to identify first. And then you can work backwards from there. I think the second step is going to be basically identify people on your team that are not you to do the interviews, because I think the problem that most founders get into is that they're so emotionally involved with the product that it's very hard to hear negative feedback. And basically, you may get defensive. Now, if you are somebody that is truly user focused and you have thick enough skin, you can run the interviews yourself, but you just have to be aware that you have to keep any defensiveness basically out of this interview, because people will feel that and they will clam up, because nobody wants to walk in and hurt somebody's feelings, especially if it's just some stranger that's just asking for some help.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to be that person. So for that, basically, if you get somebody else to run the interviews, what I would suggest doing is, first of all, find your person that basically is able to talk to a brick wall, and basically, it can basically get anybody to open up to them. Have them run the interview, and then have preferably somebody who is the best person on your team for pattern analysis. If you set something down in front of them, they'll be able to identify all kinds of different patterns and different details. Have them running the analysis, whether they sit in on the interview or they look at recordings. Totally up to you. I mean, most of the time, most people recommend not having a whole lot of interviewers in the room, because it can be intimidating for the interviewee. So I think probably the less people, the better. But if you guys are sitting there going, we have to kind of do this from, they're going to take the notes and everything, just have them pop in at the beginning of the session, say hi to the user, say, hi, I'm just here to take notes. I'm going to be running the analysis. I'm going to be popping off of audio and video, so just don't mind me. So that way it puts the user more at ease. And again, introducing everybody and explaining why they're there is a huge part of it, but we're getting more off of that steps question. Then I would say the third step is going to be going and finding users who are actually willing to talk to you. And this, depending on your business, may be harder or easier. B2C, I feel like, has this fairly easy. Most people who use B2C products and really love them or hate them are very willing to basically talk about this kind of stuff. B2B may be a little harder, but I feel like if you approach that with just this focus of, let's find our users that basically use us a lot in some cases, because a lot of questions you can answer with your current users without having to go outside your user base. Not always, but a lot, especially I feel like with activation and retention, you can do on that front. But basically just, find the folks that sit there and go, oh, hey, no, I love the product. We've used it for years. I really appreciate it. That was one of the first things I did as B2B marketing manager for Pro Writing Aid. Basically, this was a new unit, but I asked the head of sales, I said, okay, who really loves us and would be willing to sit down and talk to me and explain why they love us? So that was, one of the first things I did there. And we had probably 8 people that basically sat down and talked to me for 30 minutes, So.
Nice. Yeah. Well, Micah, you've shared so many actionable insights here. Thank you so much. I think we coming up to the half hour here, 1 hour. So I certainly want to wrap up with some rapid fire questions. These are really designed to get into your inner personality. So, are you ready?
Yes, let's go.
Yeah. Okay. What's your favorite guilty pleasure?
British cozy murder mysteries.
Oh, wow. Okay. Very specific. What are you reading right now? What would you recommend?
So kind of on this topic, basically, if people want more on this kind of non-logical intangibles that I've talked about with people with the psychology end of things, go read Rory Sutherland's Alchemy. It is probably one of the best books I have ever read on this subject, and it was quite frankly eye-opening. And I don't see a lot of people mention it on a lot of typical cyclists, but it's a beautiful masterclass in understanding that people really aren't rational creatures and how we actually make decisions and involve the emotional part of that.
Again, very rich, very insightful. If you weren't doing this job, which is really hard to imagine because I can see the passion in you, what's the most unusual job that you'd be doing right now?
I guess probably the most logical one would be I would probably still be a health coach to some degree. But if we're talking basically, anything could have happened, probably would have gone on to graduate school and ended up in some kind of a food microbiology role, something like that.
Very cool. Yeah. And what's the weirdest or funniest habit that you have that would surprise people?
I think it's that I have a very specific professional persona at work that people really don't realize that I am a massive geek and nerd about things like video games, anime, that kind of thing, because I know that all of my folks who have really only known me at work and then get to be friends with me go, "You are such a nerd. I never realized that." So I guess you'd call it a little bit of a habit.
All right. And fashion trend. What is one fashion trend that you're glad has made a comeback or you hope never does?
Bootleg jeans. I am so glad to see skinny jeans going out the door.
Nice. Well, again, Micah, there's so much that I've learned from you today. I certainly want to dig into this conversation, not interview, after the fact. But meanwhile, what's the best way for our listeners to follow your work and get in touch? Because there's so much we can pull from.
Yes, 100% LinkedIn. Basically, if you want to chat anything when it comes to user research, please come talk to me. As I said, I'm starting a new venture with basically doing a lot of this activation and user insights consulting for early stage startups and solo founders. So if you're in that category and need some help with that, please feel free to pop in my LinkedIn. Even if you just want to talk about this stuff, I love hearing from other people and hearing their perspectives. So please connect with me on LinkedIn. We'll be happy to chat. Just make sure to throw in your message that you saw me here, so that way I can make sure to prioritize your connection request.
Amazing. Yeah, this is just a teaser, really. There's so much more that we can pull apart, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Micah. It was a real pleasure to have you on the show. Really appreciate all that you've shared. And for the rest of our audience, if you enjoyed Talking SaaSy, don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn, I believe YouTube and Facebook. It's really the best way to catch future episodes and really motivates us to keep bringing you sassier stories over time.
Absolutely. And as somebody that watched episode 1, guys, this is a great group that they have going. So definitely you'll want to keep up with future episodes.
Thank you. All right. Take care. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.